How would you describe the current state of assessments?
So the current state of assessments are both promising and problematic. And they're promising in the sense that there's a lot of technical work being done to design real-time assessments that get at skill. So that's the way in which they're promising. And I think policy documents are moving in that direction, wanting teachers to have access to these skill-based metrics. There's a large recognition that state-based multiple choice tests are not very good at discriminating who knows what. But I think they're also problematic in that there's a tendency to let the perfect interfere with the good. I'm going to use that quote again because I think that we have now enough knowledge integrated from learning sciences and computer science to generate rich performance assessments that are much, much better than what we've got. And we really need to start implementing those on a broad scale. So they're both promising and problematic from that standpoint.
And how do you see the field changing as a result of technological advances?
Well, I think the field is at a very interesting point, as I said earlier. And because it's taken on this very technical work, and we're working at the intersection of these very rich, deep theoretical models and these very deep, detailed computational models, it's attracting people to the field of learning sciences and education that would not have, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, been that interested in education. So people with very strong technical skills are now becoming interested in how kids learn. And this is just fantastic because it broadens the interest, but it also broadens the skill sets that come to that are brought to bear on the problem.
In that context, what role do you see games and technology playing in shaping assessment?
I think games do have assessment potential. Because you can create a virtual reality environment. So the work that Chris Dede has done and the work that Jody Clark-Madura has done is and Diane Kettle-Hutt and Brian Nelson and that entire group of a student going to the river and collecting water and figuring out, was the water the source of the major outbreak of illness? I think that has a really nice affordance to learning, right? But I think that there's a really interesting balance to be struck, and it's not a trivial problem, because when students smell content, they sometimes become deeply disengaged.
So what are critical factors in creating game-based assessment tools that are fair and equitable?
So I think this is a really important concept that people have been aware of for a very long time in any kind of assessment, this notion of culture-fair assessment. So this problem does not go away. In fact, is perhaps even a bigger problem in today's society, where you have students who have a lot of exposure to technology, both in say they come from a wealthy district and a wealthy family. They have a lot of technology in their homes and in their schools. That student has developed a whole series of sort of tacit skills about using technology to solve a problem in a way that a student who comes from say a lower socioeconomic district, lower socioeconomic family does not. So Haberman talked about this as the pedagogy of poverty with respect to schools, where he demonstrated that schools that are wealthy, in wealthy districts, the technology was being used in service of high-level reasoning and high-level problem solving and deep engagement. And students where they have low socioeconomic bracket are using the technology sort of rote drill and kill. Mm-hmm. So I think in designing technology, it has to be culture fair in that the kinds of tasks that you're expecting students to do they have to have some prior exposure to the technology, and it's very hard to even get a metric as to how much exposure you've had to technology, right? So I think that's not a trivial problem at all. And then of course, there's general representativeness across race and gender, et cetera. Mm-hmm. That's also very important, because we know that, say for example, female students are much more likely to ask a question when they place a question in the text box of a male avatar, for example. So they themselves might not want to ask the question, but they feel more comfortable asking it as a male.
And in terms of validity and reliability, how does that play?
Validity has to do with, is the test measuring what it purports to measure? So that makes sense. So you have construct validity, face validity, etc. Now, reliability, what we want is we want an assessment that's going to get a reliable metric on what the student knows. So if I assess you on day 1 and I assess you on day 10, if you've not had exposure to that content knowledge or that skill, you should score fairly similarly, right? You might score a little bit better because you've seen the items before, but you should score fairly reliably, right? But what's an interesting paradox is that multiple choice tests can be extremely reliable, but they actually are not very valid. So what they say they're getting at and what they're actually getting at is not very good. So they're reliable, but they're not necessarily valid.
So we've talked quite a lot about the role of technology and the changing shape of assessment. What's been missing from the conversation? Anything?
So I think there's two issues. One is in the framing of the document as it stands right now. I'm talking about the next generation science standards. And the second relates to a sort of a deeper issue. So at first, I'm going to talk about the framing of the policy document around the notion of sense making. So sense making, and what we mean by that is students interpreting their data and warranting their claims and communicating their findings. Well, that's an extremely rich set of inquiry skills and represent an extremely deep understanding of science if a student can actually, interpret their data and warrant their claims, link it back to their hypothesis, communicate their findings, etc. The way in which we frame that is, I think, important. But the way in which we assess that is problematic because when you want students to be able to generate beautiful open text responses, open responses, but our natural language processing capacities really lag behind, right? And so, you'll have, something like this is 80% accurate, represents a student's knowledge, 80% accurate. Well, that's probably not good enough, for example, because if you're going to use that to decide if Johnny is going to go on to Harvard or Johnny's going to go on to University of Utah, right? That's not good enough, right? So natural language processing is difficult, especially at the younger grades, because students generate very buggy syntactic structures, and it's harder and harder to generate natural language processing algorithms in that case, right? So the second issue that I think is really important is students' engagement and motivation for science. And why I think this is important is that, grit is the single best predictor of success. So if you're going to work at something and work at something and work at something, that's a much more accurate predictor of your success, actually, than your IQ, whatever IQ measures, right? So Angela Duckworth has done some very interesting work on this. So what's missing from the conversation about the next generation standards is thinking about if a student, might have really high science scores, but absolutely hate it, you want that student to become a scientifically literate person, but the student who perhaps doesn't score as high as their cohort, but absolutely loves it, we want to be able to capture that as well. We want to be able to say, well, hey, science is just not for the guy who maybe, or the girl who got the absolute A+. If this is what you love to do and you're highly motivated to do it, you should do it, right? And that's what's missing from the conversation.
Janice, this has been really interesting. Thanks for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you.